Harris. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I am the acting First Deputy Commissioner here at the New York State Division of Human Rights. Thank you for joining us for Black Rights, How Past Movements Shape Today's Climate. I wanted to first go over some housekeeping rules for the webinar. As you enter, all attendees are placed on mute and will remain on mute throughout the discussion. We do want this to be interactive, however, so please put all your questions in the Q&A portion of your toolbar. The DHR staff will be going through those questions, making sure that they are raised to the panelists and that they are asked and answered.
Great. Well, thank you, Cicely, and thank you all for joining the panel this afternoon, Black Rights, How Past Movements Shape Today's Climate. My name is Johnathan Smith. I am the Interim Commissioner at the New York State Division of Human Rights, and it's a pleasure to be with you all for this conversation this afternoon. You know, as many of us, hopefully all of us know, over the last few weeks, we have seen a wave of protests and civil unrest across the country in response to the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. On one level, the protests have been about yet another killing by law enforcement of an African-American individual, but on a larger level, the protests have been about a system of racial inequity, anti-Black racism, and injustice that has for too long plagued our country and our society. And we know that this is not just a conversation about law enforcement. In fact, in every facet of life, far too many people in this country, and particularly Black people, see their opportunities limited or inexistent simply because of the color of their skin. Just last year, Newsday, the local paper on Long Island, published an explosive report about the current role of racial discrimination in the housing market. And what Newsday proved and showed through their investigation is the fact that so many Black people know to be the case, that the opportunity to secure a place to live, a place to raise their family, a place to have safety and security is limited, not because of their income or any other legitimate factor, but simply because of the color of their skin. And we know that this is a long-standing struggle and challenge that our country has faced. Just today, July 9th, we actually mark the anniversary of the ratification of the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, which was signed in 1868. And the 14th Amendment, among other things, guarantees a right for equal protection for all Americans. It's a constitutional provision that has been at the heart of Brown versus Board of Education, the landmark Supreme Court case of outlawing racial segregation, and so many other key decisions. And yet, despite that anniversary, we know that far too many Americans, and particularly Americans of color, don't fully enjoy equal protection. Just last week, on July 2nd, we celebrated the anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, another landmark piece of federal legislation that guarantees and outlaws discrimination on the basis of race and other categories in employment and a variety of other contexts. And yet we know too, for far too many people of color, that guarantee has not been realized. Last month, many of us celebrated the anniversary of Juneteenth, a day that is designed to mark the end of official slavery in the United States, but yet we know systems of injustice and inequality remain rampant throughout our country. And so we know that despite the protests of the last few weeks, that this is a much longer conversation. It's a conversation that has brought far too many people pain, suffering, and a sense of hopelessness. But you were excited to have this conversation today because we know, despite the struggles that we faced as a country, and despite the challenges, that we are ever improving and ever working towards creating a more just and more equal society. And I'm thrilled to be joined by three um, um, superstar, all-star experts to help us navigate some of these conversations and discussions. So I will say that the conversations that we're about to have is important not just in the context of the New York State Division of Human Rights, where we have the privilege of enforcing New York State's anti-discrimination law, but it's also tremendously personal and important to me. Having worked as a civil rights lawyer at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I've had the privilege of representing Americans and Black Americans who have seen jobs denied, housing denied, who have been subjected to unfair policing practices simply because of what they look like. As a government official, first in the federal government under the prior administration at the Department of Justice, and now here in the state of New York, I've seen how governments have both helped and hindered opportunities to guarantee equal protection for all people, regardless of their race. And finally, as a Black man and the son of Black parents and the parent of Black children, I see too every day the way, in big ways and small, the ways in which race far too often continues to define aspects of opportunity for people all across our state and country. And so this is an important discussion, but it's also one that will be, I'm sure, enriched by the conversation that we're about to have today. As I mentioned, we're joined by three experts who are going to help us dissect both the history and the current reality of race and racism and anti-Blackness in our country. As Cicely mentioned, we welcome your questions and answers, although your questions, and hopefully we'll have answers. We welcome you to put your questions in the chat, both throughout the discussion, and then we'll have time at the end of the conversation to make sure that we get to answer those questions as well. There are very long and distinguished bios for each of our panelists, and so instead of spending this whole time just talking about how great they are, we are going to make their bios available to all of you through the chat function as well. But we'll just give a brief highlight of who they are and the perspective that they will bring with us. First, we're joined by David Harris. David is a sociologist with a distinguished record as a teacher, scholar, and administrator, and on July 1st, 2018, became the 19th president of Union College in New York State. We're also joined by Ria Tabacco. Ria is the director of the ACLU Women's Rights Project, where she oversees the ACLU's women's rights litigation. She also previously served in the ACLU LGBTQ practice, as well as an attorney with and my former colleague at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And finally, we're joined by Brittny Saunders. Brittny is the Deputy Commissioner for Strategic Initiatives at the New York City Commission on Human Rights, where she works on policies and programs related to anti-Black racism, restorative justice, data-driven discrimination, and other topics. So thank you, David, Ria, and Brittny for joining us today. David, I wanted to start the conversation with you. You are an academic, a sociologist, and you've spent a lot of time in your career thinking about the role of race, of racism in our society. And so as we think about the last couple of weeks and the protests and the murder of George Floyd, can you provide us a historical context of how we got here and what role has race and anti-Black discrimination played in shaping the history of our nation?
Thanks, Jonathan. Pleasure to be with you and Brittny and with Ria. And thanks for letting the non-lawyer join the panel. So people have spent their whole careers trying to answer that question. And so it's probably good to just orient folks that I'm a sociologist demographer, not a historian, but a sociologist and demographer and a policy guy. And long before I became a senior administrator and president of a college, sociologists working on these questions. So for me, the answer really goes back to basic questions of humanity. And so when I taught courses on race and policy, I would always assign a number of things, but two of those items, one was Sojourner Truth's 1851 speech, Ain't I a Woman, which if you haven't read it, it's definitely worth a read. What she's effectively saying is, this is a movement about women's rights, And she's saying, hey, ain't I a woman as well, as an African-American or Black woman? And then also the 1899 Philadelphia Negro, which is probably my favorite book. And I love to assign this to students because if you just replace the word Negro with African-American, it's striking how much of it makes sense. And it's amazing how much of it seems like it could have been written in the last 10 years, not in 1899. And the last chapter of that book, again, like Truth, talks about the history of different groups and how those groups became accepted as fully human. And Du Bois's point is, what about us? When is it our time to be accepted as fully human? And that is what underlies a lot of the challenges we see. I look at the data, I see audit studies, which I think are quite powerful. And you see these, of course, lawyers are quite familiar with these around employment and housing. You see substantial effects of race on the extent to which people get called back for jobs, the extent to which they're told housing is available in rental markets, for example. And then I look at demographic trends, and it's clear again in public opinion data. You look at the probability that someone objects to an interracial marriage, and you see it much higher among whites, much higher among Blacks than among other groups. And you also look at, for me, what's the most powerful and saddest of all racial statistics. It's the Black-white difference in the infant mortality rate. The probability that you live to see your first birthday, and you see that it's consistently at least twice as high for children born to Black moms as opposed to white moms. And so what you see here is a story that race in our country, and if you don't have time to spend your whole career on this, I just encourage people to just listen to the 1619 podcast that came out last year. It was fantastic, one easy way to get an overview of these topics. And what you see over time is a substantial increase in the race-class interactions. You see more and more people like us, frankly, who have gone to colleges and have jobs that 70 years ago, it would have been highly unlikely that any of us would have had. At the same time, you have my favorite Tiger Woods quote. It's from now 10 years ago, probably, but the quote was, Tiger Woods can call himself a Kabbalah Asian if he wants, Caucasian, Black, American, Indian, and Asian, but it won't help him get a cab in DC at midnight. And so even if you have these class effects, there still is a substantial impact of sort of anti-perceived bias against people perceived to be African-American. So last 2 points, what you see is the shift from overt increasingly to implicit and subtle, not always, but increasingly. And you find each incidence of implicit and subtle, or each success story, in quotes, as a reason, an opportunity for people to say, there's not anti-Black racism. We had Obama as president. There's not anti-Black racism. Look at the people in this panel. Look at the school. What are you talking about? And so that's just a few minutes. Again, it's whole classes and whole careers, but a start to the conversation on how this has impacted society.
Thanks, David. And we will definitely, in the discussion, get back to one of the points you made about the way in which racism has changed and the way it plays out and manifests has shifted over time, because we know that hasn't been consistent. But one of the other points you made is that this is a conversation how our nation is going to deal with race, one that we've literally been having since the first days and moments before we were even a country, since 1619. And Rhea, turning to you, I mentioned at the outset that we are celebrating today and over this last few weeks a number of legal anniversaries that show that as a country we have attempted to address the legacy of racism and anti-Blackness. The 14th Amendment, is part of the Civil War amendments and was designed, in fact, to address the legacy of slavery. We see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that obviously happened during the Civil Rights Movement and was designed to address the legacy of Jim Crow. And those are just two examples of how we have, through the law, sought to remedy these issues. And so, would be curious to have you talk from your perspective, both at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and now the ACLU, about the role that the law and some of these landmark legislation or constitutional amendments have played in shaping how we think about anti-Blackness, and why, despite all of these landmark pieces of law, we still find ourselves seemingly having the same conversation over and over again.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think the two sort of efforts that you pulled out as examples, the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, are really striking to look at today because in many ways, there are two efforts by two sets of lawmakers at two different moments in American history, really trying to get at the same problem, which, as David phrased it, is, how do we recognize the full humanity of people who were formerly enslaved in this country? And why is it that 100 years apart, we have two separate bodies of lawmakers still trying to grapple with that very, very basic question? As you mentioned, Jonathan, I think that push and pull really began from the founding of our nation, and we see it, in the Constitution itself and in compromises like the 3/5 clause, which provided that enslaved persons counted only as 3/5 of a person. But if we fast forward to the Reconstruction era, we saw the first express mentions of slavery in the Constitution, because until that point, all of the references to slavery in our nation's founding documents were implied. It's not until the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery, that we actually see the word slavery for the first time appear in the Constitution. So there's no provision of the Constitution that expressly authorizes it. Instead, we see provisions providing that enslaved persons count as 3/5 of a person, or that the transportation of people from Africa to become slaves is permitted only for the year 1808. But we don't see the word slavery until the 13th Amendment. And in many ways, the 13th and 14th Amendments adopted in the Reconstruction era were intended to do the same thing as the Civil Rights Act, and that is to provide formerly enslaved people with the same freedom that white people enjoy to go about their business, to go to public places, to walk into a bank, a shop, apply for a job, have their hair trimmed, do all of the things that we do every day with the freedom that white Americans are able to take for granted. We won't be turned away simply because of who we are, that we won't be denied those opportunities to succeed simply because of our race. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I think, is particularly poignant because it essentially aims to do the same thing as the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And if you haven't heard of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, that's because most non-lawyers haven't. It had a very short and unfortunate lifespan, adopted in the wake of the Reconstruction Amendments. This was the Reconstruction Congress's efforts to make express what was implied in the Reconstruction Amendments, that we can't be discriminated against because of who we are when we go to public places like restaurants and theaters, when we walk into a shop. But in 1883, less than 10 years after that Civil Rights Act was adopted, the Supreme Court struck it down, finding that the 13th and the 14th Amendments, despite their promise to end slavery and their promise of equal protection under law, did not actually authorize Congress to outlaw discrimination. And since then, we have seen a push and a pull of those who would attempt to expand freedom and those who would seek to limit it. In the wake of that Supreme Court decision in 1883, some states responded by feeling emboldened to adopt both official and unofficial policies that require discrimination, policies like Jim Crow, policies that require segregation in places like public schools, restaurants, swimming pools. On the other hand, you had states like Colorado attempt to do at the state level what the Supreme Court had said Congress could not do at the nationwide level, and that is to pass laws prohibiting discrimination based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude when we go in public places. And through the next 100 years, we see this push and pull. We see some states seeking to restrict freedom, other states seeking to expand freedom. And the Supreme Court, all along the way, trying to assess each of these different provisions. Can we bar discrimination? Must we bar discrimination? It's not until 1954 in the Brown versus Board of Education decision, we see the Supreme Court saying, okay, we can't require discrimination, right? And that's huge, right? It's a reasoning that we can't require discrimination, but it's also not a ruling that says we must prohibit discrimination. For that, we had to wait another 10 years for the Civil Rights Act, for Congress to actually say, okay, it's not enough just to not allow it. We actually have to tell employers, public places, housing providers, you may not discriminate based on race. Even today, we find we are still grappling with these same questions. Do we have the same freedom as a formal legal matter? Now, none of this, of course, addresses the very real problem that David and Jonathan have both alluded to, which is that once we have that promise of formal equality under law, how do we translate that into lived equality for those of us who are still trying to go about our business? We know that the equality under law is not going to be sufficient, but it's a necessary first step towards getting us there. Do we have that today? I think all too often we assume that our civil rights laws have adequately addressed the structural barriers and that it's simply a matter of translating that or changing hearts and minds and not of addressing those underlying structural problems. But I think in many ways, we're still fighting the same battles that the Reconstruction Congress was facing. We're still seeing restrictions on the right to vote, for example. which was one of the core aspects of civil personhood that formerly enslaved people began to enjoy: the right to own property, the right to vote, the right to marry. Even today, we are still fighting, for example, restrictions on the right to vote for people who have criminal convictions, restrictions that were adopted expressly to disenfranchise Black Americans. So in many ways, the process has not been linear. We gain protections, and yet discrimination evolves. It becomes perhaps more subtle, or perhaps simply changes form, but we are still fighting over these same core guarantees of how is it that we can enjoy the freedom to exist, to be recognized under law, and to go about our business free to succeed regardless of our race.
Thanks, Ria. And certainly the notion that this is kind of an ongoing dialogue of kind of what does meaningful and real equality look like for all Americans, and particularly for Black Americans, knowing the particular role that slavery has played in our country and in the founding of our national identity, and how do we reconcile that with the reality of a society that has been, in many ways, it's been so ingrained and intertwined into how this country is identified, to your point, Ria, that there was not even a need to explicitly reference slavery. It was just somehow just considered a de facto part of our national identity. And all of these legal actions are designed to address that, and we see that that's an ongoing conversation. And to you, Brittny, again, we know, I mean, obviously, the last couple of weeks has been a wake-up call for anyone who thinks that the election of the first Black president or anything else has somehow rendered us a post-racial society. Race is still something that is present, and it matters, and it defines people. And I know that this is an issue that you, the New York City Commission, have been looking a lot to recently and really exploring. And so can you just talk to us about how anti-Black racism continues to manifest today, and how it continues to define the realities of Black people in New York City, but certainly beyond that as well?
Absolutely. So thank you for having me here and joining this conversation today. So what I'll start by saying is that the Commission, much like the Division on Human Rights, is responsible for enforcing our local and anti-discrimination law here in the city of New York. And one of the ways in which we try to fulfill our mission, which is both to enforce the law and to educate New Yorkers about their rights and their obligations under the law, is through research. So we did a report in 2017 that looked at how Muslim, Arab, South Asian, and Jewish and Sikh New Yorkers were experiencing discrimination. We did a report on sexual harassment and employment in 2018, about a year later. And then in spring of 2018, we also began this research project that was focused squarely on the experience of anti-Black racism in New York City. We wanted to understand, the points that both David and Ria have raised, right? We know that folks have these technical protections under our law and under other similar civil rights and human rights laws. But what is the actual lived experience of Black New Yorkers? And so we pursued that through a qualitative research project in partnership with a wonderful Black woman researcher named Tracy Pugh, and in partnership with a number of community-based organizations based across New York City, who helped us convene a series of focus groups, and whose leaders also sat for interviews with us to help us understand how to structure the study. And what we learned will not be surprising to any of the folks on this call who are Black, any Black New Yorkers across the state or across the country. The kind of take-home point was that the experience of anti-Black racism for the folks who we spoke to was really one that felt inescapable and quite emotionally taxing. So people talked to us about experiences that they were having interpersonally, right, with individual people in their neighborhoods or individual people at work, but they also had quite a lot of observations about structural forms of racism, right? They had observations about the ways in which the hospitals in their communities were funded, and the resources that those hospitals had at their disposal, and how that translated into the experiences that they and their family members were having when they went to seek care. They had observation about how their schools were funded, and about how disciplinary policies were applied in their schools, and the experiences of their children in those schools. They had observations about their interactions with law enforcement, right, and the experience of being subjected to violence and harassment by the NYPD. They talked about their experiences in housing. So, you know, everything from the experience of, you know, seeking an apartment and learning from the broker that the landlord has told them that the broker isn't interested in them as a potential tenant because they don't want any Black tenants, to much broader observations about the impact of gentrification and redlining in their communities over time. I'll also say that we wanted to kind of ground this report to the points that both David and Rhea have raised in a bit of history as well. So we spent some time at the beginning of the report kind of laying out a little bit of the history of anti-Black racism in what is now New York City. And starting from, you know, the days when many Black New Yorkers were enslaved and moving forward. And you really do see these kind of striking parallels. You see this kind of consistent cycle of anti-Black violence and oppression. And then you also see Black people in the city organizing and resisting against that oppression. The commission itself grows out of that sort of resistance. We were founded in the early 40s following a series of uprisings in Harlem in response to issues like police violence against Black people, housing discrimination, lack of economic opportunity. So it's really, again, kind of the same as folks have said, it's a similar fight that's being fought repeatedly, and over time, you know, there have been, I guess, changes and improvements in terms of legal protections, but there's also been retrenchment and resistance, and that's still very clear today, right? You know, I think we've all been, I think, cheered and thrilled to see the amount of focus that's been placed on anti-Black racism in recent weeks as a result of the organizing of folks who have been in the streets and who've been pushing on these issues for years. But it's also very clear, I think, from our report and from you know, folks' lived experience and from our examination of the history and sociology and law in this space, that getting at the larger structural issues is going to be a real challenge that will require kind of sustained commitment.
You know, one follow-up question for you, Brittny, and maybe for you, Rhea, as well. You know, certainly, I think all of us, you know, or most people, you know, understand, I think, one form of racism, anti-Black racism, that's a racial slur. You know, there was just a conversation in NASCAR about, you know, a possible noose being hung. You know, there's something, you know, there's a form, or even some of the examples, Brittny, you gave about someone saying, I'm not going to rent to you because you're Black. You know, that's something that I think, you know, everyone, or hopefully most people would, you know, clearly recognize as racist and unacceptable. But we also know that, I think, Rhea, you touched on this too, that the way in which people experience racism has evolved. And, you know, one area where I know both you, Rhea, and you, Brittny, have done some work in your organization is around racism based on hairstyle, hair texture. You know, I'm proud to say that just last year in New York State, we actually amended the New York State Human Rights Law to make clear that discrimination based on hairstyle or texture is, you know, a prohibited form of race discrimination. But, you know, I'd be curious to have both of you talk about, you know, why this was an issue that you all have focused on, and also, you know, what does that tell us about the ways in which anti-Black racism has evolved and some of the ways in which it continues to manifest for Black people in this country and in this state?
So I'll start, and then Rhea, of course, you should go ahead and jump in. I mean, so for us at the commission, starting in kind of late 2018, early 2019, based on both cases that were coming to us from folks who were experiencing race discrimination based on hairstyles or hair textures, they're typically associated with Black people or Black cultures, we began trying to think about what we could do with our kind of policy tools, such as they are, to clarify that this was in fact, and is in fact, a form of anti-Black racism and unlawful race-based discrimination under our law. And so, as I'm sure Rhea will talk about, like the landscape as it relates to federal law in this space was not positive, but we had some space as it related to our law, the New York City Human Rights Law, to create legal enforcement guidance, making it clear that, you know, policies in places of employment or in places of public accommodation that, you know, stigmatize or, you know, outright disallow or, you know, hairstyles or textures typically associated with Black people or Black culture, or facially neutral policies that are applied differently against Black employees or patrons, right? That is unlawful under our law. And so we put together legal enforcement guidance, making that clear. The goal of the guidance is both to be a resource to put employers and providers of public accommodations on notice that this is a form of unlawful discrimination under our law, but also to allow folks who are employees or who are patrons of different sorts of businesses or establishments to recognize that this is an issue that the Commission is in fact paying attention to, and that we are a place where they can report these sorts of experiences. And it was really well received, and that was, I think for me, one of the most rewarding things I'd had the opportunity to do as a professional to date, because it was so nice to get like text messages and messages both from strangers and from friends talking about how they had had their own experiences with this form of anti-Blackness and how kind of validating it was to see that the Commission was paying attention. That said, I think now at the Commission, we're focused on trying to think about other ways where we can use our policy tools to address other forms of anti-Black racism. But I think what the kind of issues around here illustrate is that because of the long history of anti-Blackness in this country, there's really, I can't really think of an object or an aspect of myself that has not been subject to kind of anti-Black stigma, right? It's everything. It's your hair, it is your skin, it is your facial features, it is, you know, the, you know, stores you might want to shop in. It basically pervades the experience.
I just wanted to jump in and say, I think Brittny has really undersold the significance of the City Commission's guidance, because it's hard to believe that 2019 was actually the first time we saw any express policy anywhere in this country recognizing that discrimination against Black hair as a form of discrimination against Black people. And that may sound obvious to the folks who have chosen to tune into this call, but as Brittny alluded to, you know, we've seen a long history of, you know, federal courts in particular sort of refusing to see racism based on the texture of our hair as analogous to racism based on the color of our skin, really becoming fixated on the notion that hairstyle is a personal choice. And this, I think, ties into a theme that came up earlier, which is this pushing down to the individual level, this pushing of racism onto choices made by the individual and the failure to see them as structural social problems. So, of course, it's true that one's hairstyle is a matter of choice, but one's hair texture, of course, is inherent in who we are and how we're born. And by banning natural hairstyles, employers and schools are actually requiring workers and students to chemically alter the texture of their hair, the way that it grows out of their head, as a condition of coming to work or going to school, right? We would never require people to chemically alter the color of their skin, but somehow it becomes okay to be forced to chemically alter the texture of your hair, the way that it grows out of your head, in order to go to school or go to work. And that is really, really shameful. And I think the Commission's guidance really came at an important moment, not only in terms of the development of the law, but also just a growing public awareness with the rise of so many viral videos we saw, particularly of young people experiencing discrimination based on their hair. You know, many of us, you know, watched the video of the wrestler in New Jersey, Andrew Johnson, submitting to having his hair cut off rather than forfeit a wrestling match. And we saw, you know, many white Americans praise him for his sort of team spirit. And many Black people watching that video sort of recoil in horror that he was forced to endure that in order to compete, while you know, white wrestlers were allowed to compete with longer hair, you know, tied up in a hairband or under a hairnet, not required to actually, you know, have their hair cut. So I think both making real the shame and humiliation that people can feel when they're subject to that discrimination, when they're literally given the choice of being pushed out of the playing field because of their hair, as well as the sort of legal recognition from the guidance from the commission that this is a form of anti-Black racism. And by the way, race discrimination is already prohibited in nearly every aspect of our life. So we don't need new laws. It's great that we're making plain now, and that we've seen the commission really set off a rush of states that also make express under their state law that hair discrimination is a form of race discrimination. We shouldn't need that clarification really, because it's already illegal, even in places that haven't taken that additional step.
Right. One of the points you made, Ria, is the fact that in order to address anti-Black racism, we need not just individual change, but systems to change, institutions to change. And David, turning to you, we've seen a number of institutions respond due to the George Floyd protest. I mean, first we saw many institutions, make Juneteenth a holiday for their employees. We've seen retail brands disavow racist images. Aunt Jemima comes to mind, but others. We've seen institutions of higher education, Princeton, saying that they're going to, rethink that or rename their public policy school, which has been named after Woodrow Wilson. We've seen conversations around naming schools after Robert E. Lee or other Confederate generals or soldiers, and obviously a broader conversation about the use of statutes. And so I wonder, David, as the president of a college and someone who, in your role has to think about how institutions respond generally, but also respond to this moment, what do you think, has this been an issue that has come up at Union College, but more broadly, what role do you think institutions and individuals like yourself, leaders of those institutions, have to play in this moment when we're thinking about anti-Black racism?
Thanks, Jonathan. So what I think about every once in a while is my dissertation advisor, because that's what you ought to think about every once in a while. And I remember in one of the papers I wrote, I was looking at the housing preferences by race, the extent to which whites were averse to having Black neighbors. And I spent a lot of time doing a lot of research, analyzing that data. And then I had a policy piece at the end. And he said, this is a really good paper if you get rid of the policy piece. Because you know what, you should spend at least as much time in the policy piece as you did at understanding the problem. Because this is a complex problem. You don't just get a few paragraphs at the end to say, do X. And I think about that a lot in the current context. There's a lot of folks who seem to be becoming very aware of these issues and quite exercised about them. And my concern is that we as a society risk trying to do exactly what I was doing in that paper 30 years ago, is to say, okay, here's what we go after, done. We've got to commit to the long work if we're gonna have real, sustainable, positive change. And so at Union College, we're certainly having people raise these questions and say, hey, what about so-and-so? And there's something wrong with this person, something they said which is objectionable, or something in their bio. And what I've done is to create a presidential initiative on race, power, and privilege. Because what I want to do, again, is to make sure, and frankly, right now, I can create a presidential initiative on race, power, and privilege in a way that it would have been more difficult for me to do 3 months ago. Pretty much no one's objected right now. And I think I would have heard a lot more if I'd done this 3 months ago. And what I'm saying is, let's go after all of these deep issues, and let's play both a short game and a long game. So you're seeing us do that at Union College, and I think I applaud some schools and some of their actions that have occurred recently. But I'm actually more interested in what we do to affect, for example, individuals who will be in boardrooms or PTAs, or just educating the next generation who are their kids. How are we affecting them to make positive change here, and not just go after statues and naming opportunities?
I guess building off of that, and the question I'd open to all three of you is that, we've seen so much happen about kind of anti-Black racism over the last few weeks. We have seen a lot of kind of symbolic acts of, responding to racism, but we've also seen, some policy changes in New York State. We've enacted some criminal justice reform. But we also know that, this moment, even in this moment of optimism about kind of anti-Black racism or racial justice or reconciliation, this isn't new, right? Like we talked before about, this has really been a cyclical discussion over the history of the country, but we don't need to go back to, 1619 or 1868. We can go back to 2014, where we were having the same discussion. After the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, and we saw a very similar scenes play out in streets and cities across the country. And here we are 6 years later, seemingly having the same conversation. And so I guess the question is to each of you, do you feel like this moment is different? And if so, if not, why not? And if you do think it's different, what about it is different, and how do you think it will play out?
So I just happy to two quick comments, I guess. One is, I want to be optimistic, but I wrote something recently, just share with a few folks, is I just hope George Floyd doesn't become to race what Sandy Hook was to gun violence. I just keep thinking about that. And I think about Obama tearing up repeatedly, and all of us crying and shocked and saying, this is different. Just as with George Floyd, watching for almost 9 minutes of an officer kneeling on his neck with people all around in broad daylight and saying, stop, and then begging, and he didn't until he was dead. And us saying, that's enough. And I got 3 lawyers here. You know, tell me about all the gun legislation that passed after Sandy Hook, right? You saw what happened in Congress, and you started to see what happened in Congress around race in the last month. And so I think we need to keep reminding ourselves that there are forces that lead to these inequities being sustained. And that Americans and people in general are very good about the principles of equality, but not very good in general about actual policies to bring about equality, if, and it almost always does, means that not everybody gets more. That people start to realize they're going to lose something. Some people have to be willing to give up something in the process for others to get what they deserve. And so I want to be hopeful, but maybe I'm too old to be just purely hopeful. I remember some other things, but I think creating this initiative, these kind of conversation, others, will be critically important to, hoping that we get to a much better place 10 years down the road. And it's not, the second, it's the Sandy Hook of race, which is what I worry about.
Well, I'll jump in. I'm usually the pessimist, but I think David is pushing me to be a bit more optimistic. So perhaps that's a good thing. And I'll just name a couple of things that feel different to me about this moment. Although, I agree with sort of the premise of David's comment, which is, look, I think the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was a tremendous moment, and here we are in 2020. So, the good thing is we have been here before. We've had moments of real momentum and promise. We've seen efforts at real change. Those efforts have been beaten back, right? But we somehow still are resilient, and we find those moments again. I think this is another opportunity, and obviously we remain to see sort of fully what comes of it. A couple differences that have jumped out at me. One is, we have begun to see real policy change, at least at the local level. So, a number of school districts now moving to stop having police officers in schools, something that was considered radical, just a few years ago, has now become, I think, at least in addition to actually being adopted in a few localities, something that's really under real discussion as a legitimate policy debate to be having and considering what are the alternatives. And to see that kind of movement, I think is really exciting, because the more we see, local school districts, able to make this change, and the sky doesn't fall, as we know it won't, because we didn't have police in our schools for the most of history. And then, of course, that in turn enables more jurisdictions to say, hey, we can do this too. The second thing that feels different to me is that I have seen both, public admissions and also in private, messages and texts, people really grappling with the structural problems that led to police violence outside of the criminal legal context. I've seen people say, this is the first I'm learning about redlining. I never learned this in school. I never learned this at home, right? Now, to me, that's shocking, but I'm actually really encouraged that people are now learning about these issues and are making the connection between, structural discrimination like redlining and the police violence that we're seeing today, because those connections, I think, are what we need to begin to see the structural solution. So all of that, I think, is just really, really tremendously encouraging. And then the last thing I'll say is just to push back a bit on something that you shared, David, and that's this notion that fairness is a zero-sum game. I think as long as we approach the problem that way, if there are winners and losers, nobody wants to be a loser. But at least when it comes to some of the problems that we're facing, when it comes to police violence, I do believe we can live in a country where the police do not kill civilians. we can all have that freedom. You know, people who live in wealthy communities, people who live in white communities, they have that freedom now, and extending that freedom to other communities is not going to reduce the safety of other communities. So we have to be really, really clear, right? We all deserve to live in places where we don't fear for our lives or for our children's lives simply when they go out to ride a bike or shoot hoops. And we can have that. I don't think that the one takes away from the other. And it's so, so important to have that recognition that this is not a zero-sum game, but in fact, it's bringing to, you know, underserved communities what wealthy communities have had all along, a community where, you know, you don't see the police riding around, where a community where children are free to play in their own yards or their own driveways without hiding when the police drive by.
Yeah, and I think what I would just add is I do think, to David's prior point, like when he was talking about the commission that he created, I think that expectations have shifted dramatically. Again, we don't know precisely how long it will last, but the things that I see as being politically possible now versus what my assessment would have been like 3 to 6 months ago is really dramatic. So that does give me some hope. And I think it points to the, not necessarily a new lesson, but the important lesson around the real connection between, you know, advocacy and organizing and what that enables in government and in private institutions as well. And I'll say that to, you know, like, again, to the point that we don't know how long it's going to last, I think for the commission, we're really focused now on what we can do at this time that will kind of have staying power and, you know, hopefully last beyond when this particular administration is in place. So coming out of the report, one of the commitments that we have made is to reach out to, and we've already started this process of reaching out to the organizations in Black communities across the city and talk to them about what their current policy priorities are and to figure out, like, what is the next wave of policy steps that the commission should be taking, whether it's through, you know, best practice documents or legal enforcement guidance or rules or through, you know, work with folks on legislation. What should we be doing now in order to better protect and support Black communities? And so we have some thoughts of our own, but we're in this process to try to learn from our partners about what their current priorities are so we can make sure that the things that we develop are really responsive. But I think that's kind of where we are in the space, which is that we're trying to make sure that we put more things into place that will have some staying power and last for a while and hopefully be models for other jurisdictions as well.
Yeah, and one place of optimism, at least for me, is the fact that, you know, in all of these recent protests, the fact that we've seen such a diverse coalition of people come together. Obviously, we've seen many Black communities, but, you know, sometimes you look at these protests and there's more white people than Black people there. And I think that, you know, we're going to get to the issue of allyship in a moment, but, you know, I think that's also really important. And I think when people, as I think some of you mentioned, when people see this as a joint struggle and really a joint conversation, I think that's really important. And the other thing too, you know, certainly, you know, there has been this long push and pull of government action, but the fact that we also see other parts of society, whether it be universities or businesses, and yes, some of that could seem maybe tokenistic, and, you know, not all things are equal, but the fact that, you know, we're having these conversations, you know, like David's commission, I think are really important. And if those do translate into real policy changes, I think that will also drive, you know, similar to what you said, Brittny, a longer term kind of conversation about how we continue to think about what policy prescriptions we need going forward. Yeah, I will remind people to put questions into the Q&A function, and we're about to turn to them. Just two final questions before I do that. First, I wanted to just go to you, Ria. You know, certainly we've had a really long conversation you know, about racism and recently about anti-Black racism, but we obviously know that Black communities don't have a monopoly on discrimination or mistreatment, and, you know, many other communities across our state and across our country continue to be highly vulnerable to discrimination and persecution for just simply for who they are. And I know that you were actually a key lawyer and player in the recent Supreme Court decision that was decided last month, making clear that sexual orientation and gender identity are covered under the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that you were talking about, which covers employment discrimination. And so I wonder if you could just talk briefly, both about that decision, but also, the fact that, a lot of, I know the arguments that were advanced in that case and around similar cases really, kind of are grounded in kind of understandings of anti-Black racism and how the law both has and has not responded to that. And so what can we learn from this moment about anti-Black racism that might be applicable to other movements and other struggles for equality as well?
Thanks, Jonathan. Well, it's always nice to take a moment to celebrate the wins that we've had in the past several months, because there have been many, many dark days, and these bright spots have been even more important. The decision that Johnathan referenced came on June 15th in a case that's now known as Bostock versus Clayton County, where the Supreme Court recognized that firing someone simply because they were LGBTQ is a form of discrimination that is prohibited by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is so critical because we know that LGBTQ people experience incredibly high rates of employment discrimination. A study done just a few years ago by the Center for American Progress found that 1 in 4 LGBT people reported having experienced workplace discrimination in the last year alone. So just in that 1 year period, 1 in 4 survey respondents had experienced workplace discrimination. And when you multiply that over the course of our professional lives, obviously, really, really tremendous rates of discrimination, even higher for LGBTQ people of color, and particularly for people who are transgender and people of color, with Black transgender women sort of being at the intersection of all of these identities and experiencing the most egregious discrimination at work and in other places. Why is the Supreme Court decision so exciting? The Supreme Court's decision was based on part of the Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination based on sex. So we've talked a lot about prohibiting discrimination based on race, but parts of the Civil Rights Act also prohibited discrimination based on sex. And sex was added to Title VII sort of at the last minute in Congress, and there's been a lively debate among historians as to the motivation for adding sex. Was it supposed to be a joke? Was it supposed to defeat Title VII altogether? Was it intended perhaps to address fears held by some white women that if Black women were protected from workplace discrimination, but not white women, that somehow the law might unintentionally give Black women a leg up? So we'll never know why it was adopted, but what we do know is that, since 1964, the prohibition on sex discrimination has come to encompass just a range of forms of discrimination that we now see as illegal, but in 1964 were just incredibly common. One, for example, is just the sheer segregation of jobs by sex alone. In 1964, it was typical if you opened a newspaper to see help wanted ads, to see help wanted male, help wanted female. And even in the first few years after sex discrimination was prohibited, we saw the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the federal agency charged with enforcing Title VII, saying that's not sex discrimination. It took a few years even to see that excluding someone from a job altogether because they're a man or because they're a woman is sex discrimination. In 1989, we saw the Supreme Court recognize that sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination when it happens at work and when it interferes with people's opportunity to succeed. And just last month, we saw the Supreme Court recognize that when an employer discriminates against a man because he's attracted to other men, or against a woman because she was assigned the sex of male at birth and not female, that too is a form of sex discrimination because it necessarily turns on that employee's sex, a quality that Congress had already told us in 1964 should be irrelevant to our opportunity to succeed at work. It's just worth noting, since we are here talking about anti-Black racism, that the Supreme Court's very first decision under Title VII was not a race discrimination case, but a sex discrimination case. It was a case brought by a woman named Ida Phillips, who had been denied a job because she was the mother of small children. And she was seeking to work on a factory line, and the employer's defense was, we love women. We hire women in droves. In fact, 75% of our workforce is women. We just don't want to hire women with small children. We think they should be home taking care of their kids, or we're just worried they're going to be distracted with preschoolers running around. We're just not going to hire those kind of women. And that case was actually argued not by a women's rights attorney, because there were precious few at the time, but by a lawyer from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund who recognized, even though Ida Phillips was a white woman, and even though this was sex discrimination and not race discrimination, if that employer won, if an employer could so easily evade the ban on discrimination by saying, well, we have lots of women here, just not this kind of woman, that the same was quickly going to be true for race discrimination, and that was going to essentially gut the promise of Title VII before we had even gotten started. And so the Legal Defense Fund made the decision to take up Ida Phillips's case and succeed and won, meaning that it was no defense to say we have other women, because this woman, Ida Phillips, was denied a job simply because she was a woman. If she had been a man with preschool age children, she would have been eligible for the job. And I think that was so prescient on LDF's point, because when we look at the Civil Rights Act, we are all in this together. All of these forms of discrimination intersect, and as soon as we lose ground on one form, sort of on one front, we're going to experience the same hits. But the other side of that means we can also look at what has worked for other movements, right, and build on successes. So it doesn't have to be just sort of sharing in the losses. We can share in the victories as well. And I do think there are many parts of the recent Supreme Court decision that will benefit everyone who's facing employment discrimination. The recognition, for example, that it doesn't matter what an employer thinks they're doing. So one of the arguments in the Supreme Court cases was that these employers weren't penalizing, for example, Don Zarda because he was a man, or Amy Stevens because she was a woman. They just didn't like gay people, or they didn't like trans people. And somehow if you call it sexual orientation discrimination, or you call it transgender status discrimination, that somehow means it's not also sex discrimination. And the Supreme Court recognized, right, it can be both things at once. It doesn't matter how you label something. When you talk about someone's sexual orientation or their transgender status, you can't even define what those terms mean without taking sex into account, right? And that means that it's sex discrimination. The fact that you could also call it sexual orientation discrimination doesn't matter. And I think that is going to be so key for all of us, because as David mentioned, you know, as employment discrimination and all discrimination becomes in some ways, sometimes more subtle, more invidious. We rarely are going to see an employer that admits they haven't hired someone because of their race. But they do offer up all kinds of other rationales. And this gives us a way to understand that the fact that you can describe something as discrimination based on one characteristic doesn't mean it's not also discrimination based on sex or race or religion or something else we know to be prohibited. And that, I think, is going to be tremendously useful to people who experience discrimination going forward.
Great, thanks, Rhea, and congratulations to you and to the entire team. That is truly also a landmark victory, and one that I'm sure 50 years from now, they'll also be talking about on a panel just like this. You know, I want to turn to the Q&A and also, in so doing, maybe merge both the last question I had for all of you with one of the questions, you know, from the panelists. You know, we have a comment from Carl Brown saying, well, there's two comments, but I think they're related, about kind of how we view people, and, you know, how white people view Black people, you know, to Rhea, to your example, how we view LGBTQ people. And we know that, you know, whether we want to couch in a red state versus a blue state or any other type of, you know, framework, we know that there are divisions in how we view and look at kind of the other. And yeah, I think that ties into this issue of how do we become allies in struggles for equality, and particularly at this moment, you know, how can white Americans or non-Black Americans really partner with Black communities and really try to tackle some of these entrenched systems of racism and discrimination. So, you know, how can people be good allies in this moment?
I mean, I think some of it relates to the sort of support for policy change, like what we've seen a little bit of recently, and I think hope to see more of. So it is certainly powerful to have people in the streets alongside Black Americans calling for racial justice, but it is also powerful, and will be even more so over the long run, to have folks being willing to make phone calls and you know, advocate for issues that, you know, Black organizers are pushing for and prioritizing. I think all of that is incredibly helpful. I've also said before, and I really believe it, that it is also important for people to challenge their fellow white people when they hear them saying or see them doing things that they know to be, or recognize to be, or suspect to be racist. Because I think that is, you know, I don't know, but I would suspect that happens quite a bit. And because of different interpersonal dynamics or people's fears around confronting people that they love or that they're in different types of relationships with, It doesn't get addressed, but it is really, I think, an important part of changing the culture around the acceptability of casual racism, which of course we know translates into all sorts of other actions when the same people go to their work and are employers, or the same people, you know, are housing providers or whatever else. So I think action at all those levels are important parts of allyship.
I guess just pick up right where Brittny was. So as someone who studies race and policy, who's African American, it's hard to count how many times I've had a white person tell me their Black story, as I call it. So it is, well, you know, let me tell you about a nephew I had who dated a Black woman, and here's what happened. Or let me tell you about, right? And I almost always react the same way. I listen, talk to a little, and then if I feel like I can get away with it, I will then ask the question at the end, which is, do you ever tell this story to white people when there's no African Americans or other people of color around? And the answer is almost always no. And people think, oh, geez, I guess I don't. And so Brittny, to your point about allyship, and this is some of your privilege, part of it is about being proactive and saying, hey, whoa, what are you talking about? But the other piece is to try to figure out how you as a white person who knows some can help inform others, so we don't always have to do the work ourselves and tell yet another person what happened to us. Because what's been really striking to me is how many people at Union, as I've told some of my stories and around the country, are just shocked by things they hear. And I think, how could you possibly be shocked that those things are happening? And it's because I don't want to go around telling people all day. It's tiring, and it's just sort of, I don't want to spend my life that way. And white folks are not telling others enough. So Brittny, I think, builds on some things that allies can do.
I'll just add, I think people have to really be willing to put their money where their mouth is. One thing that has been become so apparent to me in this moment, but also just through becoming a parent, is, you know, how many white people are, you know, professionally involved in movements for social justice or racial equity, but yet are perfectly comfortable, you know, moving to an all-white neighborhood or sending their children to an all-white school. And when that happens, when people tell me about the choices they're making, again, without any hint of self-consciousness or any consideration why I might not choose to send my children to a school where they would, you know, be stigmatized and othered, it really feels like a teachable moment. And at the same time, it's exhausting. To Brittny's point, it's exhausting to always be the one who's sort of creating those moments. So I would challenge people to really, if they want to be allies, think about the choices they make in their own lives, whether those choices are true to the values that they're espousing. And when they see others making choices that are not consistent with those values, to take on some of the emotional labor of calling in those people to talk about, you know, to talk about those decisions, to talk about what kind of world we are creating for the next generation when we make those choices in our own lives, you know, while, you know, protesting in the streets one day and then retreating to a community that looks, you know, very different than the one we claim to want.
Oh, great. All good points. You know, we have another somewhat related question from an anonymous attendee. And the question is, you know, it's actually directed towards state agencies, although I think it's probably broader to all institutions. You know, all of our institutions, you know, have policies, you know, they're in fact mandated by law. Some of the laws Ria was talking about that prohibit discrimination, that prohibit racism in the workplace, in other interactions regulated by the agency or by the company. But yet, you know, one of the conversations that we've been having, you know, is saying that you're not a racist is not the same as being proactively anti-racist. And so are there ways that, you know, and again, I open this to all of you, but from an institutional perspective, how do we move the conversation from just saying racism is not allowed to actually having institutions that affirmatively, you know, actively work against racism and other forms of discrimination in the workplace?
Again, I think people have to be willing to not just talk, but also to take action. Another sort of exciting thing that I've seen chatter about in the last few weeks is recognition that, you know, inclusion targets, which have long been used in the context of sex discrimination, for example, the Rooney Rule, where the NFL has a woman in each pool when it's hiring a coach. So we can take some of the lessons learned from this space, lessons like inclusion riders used in Hollywood to increase the number of women directors. we can apply these to the racial justice context as well. You know, it's true that we can't make a decision about any particular candidate based on race, but we can commit to saying, you know what, I'm interviewing 4 people. I'm going to make sure I have a person of color in the pool. You know what, I'm growing my company by 50% in the next few years. I want us to reflect the population that we serve, or the population of folks that are coming up in our community and that are qualified to do this job. We can actually set real targets, and we can make real commitments to taking steps to increase that. If you don't interview any Black people, we are certainly not going to end up hiring a Black person in the job. If you look around your workplace and you say, you know what, there are no Black managers here, ask yourself, why is that? Who did we look at in the last round? How did we find those candidates? Could we have done better outreach? Could we have gone beyond, you know, Ben's buddy from college to get resumes? And could we have really been intentional about seeking applicants? And then when we got those applicants, you know, bringing them into the office, giving them a chance to show us what they can do before we ultimately made the decision and picked the best person. Because again, if we don't have those options in the room, we are certainly not going to pick them. I would like to see, you know, more employers really, really commit to these kinds of inclusion targets, which are lawful, can be done in a way that is consistent with civil rights laws. And really, I think will change the conversation when you have people of color, and particularly Black people, in leadership positions they have long been excluded from.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is just to say, I think it's particularly important in government to really strive to have a workforce that's reflective of the community that you're supposed to serve. I think that's something that is just essential to making sure that you are actually learning of the issues that are of highest priority to people, that you are serving and supporting people in a way that is appropriate, that you are just able to ensure that folks who have for too often had relationships with government that have, you know, have kind of eroded their trust or undermined their ability to trust government. I think now is a real opportunity for government institutions in particular to kind of lean into changing the way they operate and, you know, making sure that they're building staffs that can do that kind of work effectively.
One other question we have, I know we only have a few minutes left, so maybe this is a loaded question and a lot to answer, but if you all could give a short response. So and it goes back to, I think, a point that David, you and Rhea were making before about, you know, when we talk about advancing anti-racism principles or ideals, the notion of, do people have to give something up, you know, in order to kind of address these issues? And, you know, we live in this question from Catherine makes the point that, you know, we live in a world where we know that there's scarcity, that there's not, you know, enough for everyone oftentimes when it comes to resources or supplies. And so when we talk about racism and anti-Black racism, is there a way to frame this conversation so people, in this case, I guess non-Black people, feel like that they don't have to give up something in order for us to, you know, have a society and a country or a state that you know, is living up to its promise of equal protection for all? So again, a really complicated question, but if you have a short answer for that fundamental human question, that'd be great.
I can go with 3 quick points. Oh, go, Rhea. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think when we do have this notion of scarcity, I really just challenge us to ask ourselves, first of all, is it true? Is this really a place where resources are scarce, or can we all have safety? And if it is true, for example, in the context of our public schools, we don't have enough money for every public school to be the school that we would want to send our children to right now, then ask ourselves, can we change that, right? Because that scarcity is artificial. We have made a series of policy choices about how much resources we're willing to allocate to certain parts of life. And if I don't want to send my kids to that school, how can we increase the pot so we do have enough resources to make every school a school where I would feel comfortable and even joyful about sending my child?
Oh, that was faster than I thought. So speed round. So 3 quick things. One is, I think that you don't have to give up anything if we're talking about the basics. So the right to not be profiled by the police, killed by the police. Yes, whites generally don't have to give up anything, although some would argue that they give up their sense of safety, if that. So some would argue that. But the 2 more important points is back to that same dissertation advisor. When you think about policy changes, you are, in most cases, going to have, some people are going to have to give up something. What you want to find is the non-linearities. When what one gives up is quite small and what another group gains is quite large. And that is really the places you want to go first. And the last thing to say about this is a hopeful point, I guess, which is you need to expand this beyond just the material to the psychological, because one of the keys is that you think about Emmett Till, right? You think about what people are seeing with George Floyd. What people who are not Black are experiencing right now is significant discomfort, sort of psychological discomfort about the society they're in and the things that are occurring. And they benefit if you reduce that discomfort while some other group benefits materially. And so if you expand it beyond just the economic or other aspects, I think there's another way in which you can have some win-wins here.
And I think that's absolutely right. The thing that immediately came to my mind, Johnathan, when you asked that question was like, it's clear to me there's kind of like one set of things that white people will have to give up, which is to the extent that your sense of self or your sense of value is predicated on knowing that you are, or believing that you are better than, you know, more worthy than, more deserving of Black people in this country, or that your culture has to be dominant or whatever else it may be. Like that is something that people have to get used to giving up and get ready to give up. But I think David is absolutely right that there are areas where like the loss is so small and the material gain for people who are currently suffering is huge. And I think Rhea is right that like there is like the possibilities are actually endless if we start to push on these ideas of scarcity, right? And look at the policy choices that have put us in this box and push back. So it's probably a mixture of both, but yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Well, thank you. I want to thank David, Brittny, and Rhea for participating in this discussion today about Black rights and for contributing your expertise, your experiences to this discussion. I've greatly enjoyed it, and I hope our viewers have enjoyed it as well. You know, as a reminder, Brittny made this point about, you know, the fact that both the New York City Commission and DHR, the State Commission, we are available as a resource for anyone who has experienced or is experiencing discrimination, whether it be by race or by any of the other protected status classes that are covered, sex, LGBTQ status, a very long list. I would encourage you to reach out to either agency. Obviously, the New York City Commission that covers New York City, New York State covers the state, but there's no cost to filing a complaint. Every complaint is impartially investigated, and there's a process that is laid out on our website. If you want more information, our information for the state, you could visit us online, dhr.ny.gov, or call our bias hotline, our anti-bias hotline, 1-888-392-3644. We also today are releasing a toolkit of resources about racial discrimination, and we would encourage you to visit our website, dhr.ny.gov, to obtain a copy of that toolkit. Again, I want to thank each and every one of you, and as well as our panelists, for joining this conversation today. And again, I think as we talked about, there's work that all of us can do to make sure our country and our state lives up to our promise of equal protection and equality for all. And we hope that you all take those steps in your own lives, in your organizations, and in your community. So thank you again, and have a good afternoon to all.